I'd like you to turn in your Bible to the book of Judges, chapter number 7. In the book of Judges, chapter number 7, I want us to spend some time tonight discussing this idea of overcoming the odds. Oftentimes it seems that the odds are stacked up against the ones who either are Christians or the ones who serve the Lord. I don't know if you heard recently that Australia is looking to ban all reference to the name Jesus at all. Because we don't want them to feel, the little children to feel forced into Christianity in some way. We can go on and on and on and cite all sorts of news articles and all sorts of points that I believe would establish this premise that the odds are often seemingly stacked against us. Sometimes it seems as though God asks us to do the impossible, certainly at least the difficult. There are times when God's plan seems to be nothing more than a great mystery which we struggle to understand. It's at this point in time that faith is what enters the scene. We need to understand that God oftentimes chooses to do things in ways that man would not choose to do things. Isaiah chapter 55 describes it this way, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." As I read this particular passage, I, for one, am very thankful that God does not operate the way that I do. If he did, the world would be considerably less populated, I'm sure. There would be issues that would just be immediately resolved, and we would not wait for people to have any kind of time. As far as the idea of patience, well, that's rather limiting as well, and so I'll give you at least one or two mess-ups, but after that, we're just going to move on. And that's often the way man thinks. It's oftentimes the way that man works and the way that man believes that God should work, unfortunately. But it's a great encouragement to know that God's ways are not our ways. His ways are actually higher than ours, and I would add to that they are infinitely higher than ours. There are ways that are far beyond our comprehension and far beyond our ability to be able to understand. We can say that God's methods are oftentimes unconventional. In fact, if you were to go through the Word of God, you would find many instances where God's methods and God's ways were often ridiculed, they were criticized, or at times they were even debated. Would you have ever imagined manna falling from the sky for food? No, we would have had a different plan. Would you have ever figured that God would cause water to come out of a rock to quench the thirst of a group of people that's estimated between 1 and 2 million people? It's a lot of water. When the spies were sent into the land, all but 2 of them concluded that victory was impossible and actually that defeat was inevitable. Consider God's design to defeat the city of Jericho. Would you have come up with such a strategy as that? Would you have ever chosen a young shepherd boy to defeat a giant who was a veteran in war? Would you have chosen a poor young peasant girl to bear the Messiah? We could cite many more examples, but all of them serve to illustrate God's methods are oftentimes unconventional. The ones whom God chooses to use, often man would not choose to use. I remember in college listening to individuals, and at times it was professors, at times it was other students who would look at maybe a student who was a little bit of a clown or a little bit of a cut-up in class, and they would oftentimes indicate by statements that this person's never going to go on and do anything for the Lord. And then there were those that were always heralded as the epitome of whatever Bible college. I happen to be an ambassador, but there are other colleges that would choose their own students. And these were the ones who were going to go out, and these were the ones that we're truly going to put our mark on, and they're going to be successful. And I found after nearly 20 years of having graduated from college that many of those whom people said will never do anything are the very ones still faithfully serving the Lord. And the ones who had that seeming mark on them that they're going to go and do exactly, oftentimes have fallen by the wayside. You see, man does not choose things the way that God chooses. His apostles are a perfect example of that. God's ways are often unexplainable. There's a lot about God's ways that I find to be irrational. When we look at circumstances, things oftentimes do not make sense. Things oftentimes do not seem to add up. You can look at that in your own personal finances. You can look at that on a host of other areas in your own personal life that if you were to try to just somehow explain it, well, there really is no means of explaining it. It's because it's irrational. It's unexplainable. But I want you to understand that although his methods may be unconventional and they may often be unexplainable, they are always best. There's not a person in this world who will ever be able to improve on what God has already done. There's not a plan that man will ever institute that is in some way going to somehow be superior to God's plan. We may think as though we have the solutions to various things and various crises even around the world. The reality is that God has all of these things in perfect control. His answers are always best. His solutions to the world's problems are always best. And his solutions to our problems as individuals are likewise always best. We've all learned that when we get our hands into the solution, we often create quite a mess. I wish that we would learn it to the point we wouldn't have to continue repeating that particular lesson, but it seems to be one of the favorite courses for Christians to repeat in God's school of instruction. Let me get my hands in this and I'll see if I can work it out this time. I know that for however many years, every time I've done this, it's failed and failed miserably, but I think this time is going to be different. It's absolutely foolish, yet we all realize how quickly we tend to gravitate towards that type of thinking. Let me challenge you that there are ways of being able to overcome the odds. But sometimes those ways are extremely unconventional. Oftentimes they are unexplainable, but they are always best. I believe that is exactly what we find here in the book of Judges, chapter number 7. I want us to begin by looking at the preparation for battle. Keep in mind that God has already told Gideon in chapter 6 that he was the man to deliver Israel. God graciously confirmed that point via 2 miraculous signs with the fleece. On the first night, Gideon requested that the fleece would be wet and the ground around it be dry. God granted him his request. The second night, he requested that the fleece would be dry and the ground would be wet the next day, and once again, God granted him his request. As we have emphasized already, these fleeces that Gideon put out were not to seek his direction. They were instead intended to confirm his direction. God had already revealed what he wanted. Gideon was simply seeking to confirm it. I mentioned it a little bit this morning in one of the messages that it is very easy for us to criticize Gideon for this act. But I do not believe that we completely understand the situation that faced him. Mathematically, defeat seemed inevitable. Gideon has amassed an army, quote unquote, and they're far from an army, of 32,000 individuals. We know that 135,000 end up being slain, so the number was at least that. The odds are over 4-1. They are not at all in your favor. The record that we are allowed to read is one that illustrates, however, a great battle that was looming in Gideon's own soul as he wrestled before God over what it was that he was faced with. He was responsible for not just his own life, but the lives of those whom he led into battle. If he failed, his failure would alter the lives of many different families. We might say that the stakes were extremely high. The situation was extremely real. But this was the moment for Gideon to defeat the Midianites. We might even say that it was either now or never. As Judges chapter 7 begins, we find the reduction of the army in the first 8 verses. The Bible says in verse number 1 that then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Herod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. Jerubbaal, you recall, was given the name given to him in chapter 6 by his father after he tore down the altar of Baal and cut down the grove that was beside it. All of those, it would be a group of 32,000, as we would come to learn throughout the chapter, gathered very early in the morning and pitched their encampment beside the well or the spring of Herod. It was a spring that was just south of the hill of Morah. The Midianites are on the north side in the valley of Jezreel. Gideon and his army are higher up elevation-wise and are able to look down into a huge camp that was estimated to be perhaps 5 miles away in that area. In my opinion, it seems as though things were maybe beginning to get a little bit settled for Gideon. Gideon had already wrestled whether or not he was the man to conquer the Midianites, and God told him that he was and reaffirmed that he was. And so now Gideon says, okay, well, Lord, let's just go ahead and go on with this, and we'll see how it all works out. And about the moment that things seem to be getting settled for Gideon, God all of a sudden redirects. Have you ever been there in your life? Have you ever had those times when it just seems as though you finally are beginning to get a little bit of a handle on what it is that God's doing, a little bit of a handle on what it is that is being directed in your life or that which He is asking you to do, and then all of a sudden God throws the infamous curveball your direction. Something that you would have never seen coming. The Lord said in verse number 2 unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands. I wonder, did Gideon say, excuse me? I have 32,000 people. In order for us to defeat them, each person is going to have to kill 4, and that's assuming one of them doesn't die before he kills anybody. Because if that happens, the odds just went up. Now we've got to kill a few more. Thank you. Okay? And all of a sudden, everything begins to change. And so, here's the reason. He says, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me. You know, God knew that man would vaunt themselves, or man would claim the victory. Man would actually say, you know what, this was something that I was able to do. God oftentimes places us in circumstances in which He is the only way out. We often regard ourselves as being very independent and capable of taking care of ourselves. I remember growing up in my home that my dad always taught me to be independent and to think independently, and at times that independence got a little bit in the way. I began to think I was independent just a little bit too early. I didn't need all of this other stuff, and my father explained to me the financial investment that he was putting into my life every day, and I soon discovered, you know what, I can't go out and live on my own. Dad, home feels awfully good right now, and thank you for providing it. But all of a sudden, we find ourselves often very independent of God. Oftentimes, that mindset is, I believe, unintentional. There may be some who intentionally set out to try to be independent of God, but I think oftentimes it's more unintentional. If you look in your own life, what you'll find is that you increasingly become, even unconsciously, more and more independent of God. Our routines of our life cause us to just get up and go to work like we do it every day. Do we ask God's blessing on the day? Well, I did yesterday. Man, I was pretty busy today. And before long, what used to be a routine to us is now the exception when we start asking for God's help in various situations. Most of us have all experienced times when God has reminded us of the fact that He's in control. It may be something as simple as looking for something that has been misplaced. We look and look and look and look and look and look and look for it. And then we decide to pray. Isn't it interesting how many times after we decide to pray that's when it actually shows up? I wonder how much time would have been saved if we would have prayed earlier. If we would have gone ahead and thought through some of these things. You see, we find ourselves naturally becoming more and more independent of God. God desires for us to become more and more dependent upon Him. And God recognized, if I allow 32,000 to defeat the Midianites, then they are going to claim that they did this independently of me. And so God put them in circumstances in which they were utterly incapable of overcoming or being victorious in, and God will do the same for us today. These are also the moments that end up defining and strengthening our faith. These are the victories that God grants, victories that we cherish because we're able to look back and say, this was something that was none other than God. These are the victories that we oftentimes cling to when times are extremely difficult. I hope you're able to point back in your life to certain things that you would say, these are things that only God could have done. If you can't do so, you're missing a significant part of the Christian life. You're able to point back and say, man, I can list example after example after example. This was something that only God could have done. And these victories actually strengthen our faith. I don't have the time to turn to 1 Samuel 17, but you may very well be very familiar with the passage. David is fighting a very tall man by the name of Goliath. Do you remember before he actually went out to battle? Of course, he was criticized by his brother. He was told he couldn't do it by the king. He was trying to give the armor for Saul and all of this stuff. And finally, David said, you know what? I've had some experiences in my life that cause me to be assured God is going to grant this victory. I said I don't have time to turn to it. I don't have time not to turn to it. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter number 17. 1 Samuel 17. David has endured a tremendous amount of criticism and negativity. The idea is, David, you should never do this. You're incapable of doing this. David, you are here for the wrong reasons. And the list goes on and on with David. But I want you to notice verse 34 of 1 Samuel 17 and notice how these past victories strengthened David's faith for the present battle. Verse 34, the Bible says that David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Now notice verse 37. David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. You know, David didn't say, boy, you should have seen me. I reared back after him and I caught that lion by his beard and killed him just like that. It's awfully close to his mouth, by the way. Okay? You can imagine going after any of these animals. Most of us would probably have let the sheep go. David didn't do that. But what I want you to understand is that he did not claim the victory himself. He recognized, you know what? God did this for me back here. And here's another thing that God did for me back here. And knowing that God did this for me back here gives me the strength to know God's going to do this for me today. Our lives are living testimonies of how God works in our lives. Every single one of us has different testimonies and different things where we would be able to point back to God and say, you know what? God did this for me back here. And God did this for me back here. I can rest assured He's going to take care of me here. These past victories strengthen our faith. The Israelites, you may recall, and you can go back to Judges 7 now, the Israelites erected a memorial to commemorate the crossing of the Jordan River in the city of Gilgal right before they began to conquer the Promised Land. Why? To remind the Israelites and the succeeding generations of that which God had done for them. Your victories may be small or they may be great, but the victories that God grants you need to be cherished, because those are the things that God does. And when you begin to see God in those little details, even some of the smallest things will be some amazing answers to prayers, because that was your Father who did that. And it is an amazing thing that will strengthen your faith. This battle was something that would prove to be something only God could do. It was a great challenge for both Gideon as well as the Israelites. And God said, "You've got too many." And so he began then to reduce the army. And he's going to use two different tests. The first one is that he will dismiss those who feared to fight. I can imagine if I were encamped there, number one, that might be a little bit of a surprising thing. But then Gideon comes along and says, okay, well, the Lord said, verse 3. Now therefore go to proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. All right, guys, anybody here fearful or afraid? I want you to leave very early the next morning. I want you to leave right away. Go ahead and leave. You imagine 22,000 depart and only 10,000 remain? I cannot imagine what Gideon was going through at this point in time. I know we'll criticize him once again for having to have all of this confirmed. I cannot imagine leading a group of people and losing 2/3 of them just like that. I wonder how many of them he knew personally. Are you kidding me? What are you doing? I counted on you. Mr. Muscles, you can't leave. Okay? You were the only hope that we had. Why is it that all the skinny, scrawny guys are staying? Yeah. It would be unimaginable to me as one leading to say 2/3 abandoned. Wow. The Bible actually says in Deuteronomy chapter 20 verse 8, maybe some of you have a cross-reference to this, and there are some instructions regarding warfare, who is actually to be excused from battle. Well, Deuteronomy 20 and verse 8, the officers shall speak further unto the people, and they shall say, what man is there that is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return unto his house, notice, lest his brethren's heart faint as well as his heart. Very interesting. God recognized the tendency that man has to feed off one another for good or bad. You know how quickly negativity spreads? Spreads much more quickly than positivity, if that's a word. Okay? It is like a wildfire in many ways. It is a cancer that just simply spreads very quickly. We cannot allow that kind of a negativity to dominate our Christian life, or certainly our ministry. I wonder if Gideon thought, okay, well, I passed the test. The Lord said unto Gideon in verse 4, the people are yet too many. Lord, really? We just went from 1 to 4 now to 1 to about 13. And you're telling me I still have too many people? He said, so I want you to bring them down unto the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. It's interesting to me that he did not tell him what the actual test was going to be until after he had already responded in obedience. I want you to go down to the water. And there's going to be 2 groups of people. One group, I'm going to say, needs to go home. The other group is going to be the ones that stay. Just get them down to the water. You know, God leads that way, one step at a time. We want the big plan. Lord, my curiosity is killing me. Tell me the test. I won't tell anybody else, but just tell me the test. Don't leave me in the dark on this. And so he brings them down to the water, and this would be the spring that would be there. He brought the people down under the water, and the Lord said unto Gideon, Every one that lappeth of the water with his tongue, as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise, every one that boweth down upon his knees to drink. We find out that the lapping is described just a little bit better in verse 6. The number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men, but all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink water. It seems as though there were individuals who knelt and would basically put their hand in the water, and they would cup the water and bring it back to their mouth. These were set in one group. And then there were those who knelt on both hands and knees, perhaps even lay down and just simply stuck their face in the water. None of these people knew what the test actually was. And so here's Gideon looking at all of these people who are drinking water. All right, you on the left and you on the right. You're on the right and you're on the right and you're on the right. You're on the right and you're on the right and you're on the right. You're over here. This little group over here is probably the one God's going to send home anyway. And he divides them all up into the groups. You guys picture this, all right? This is faction. You put yourself here. And all of a sudden, all right, now we've got 10,000 people who now have drunk water. And now there's a test. And so the Lord said unto Gideon, By the 300 men that lapped will I save you and deliver the Midianites into thine hand. Let all the other people go, every man unto his place. I want these 9,700 to go back home. Keep these 300. A lot of speculation has been done as to the reason they were sent home. Most of us have probably heard that it's got to do with their military awareness and the ability to be engaged in battle. If you've got your face stuck in the water, you've got no idea of what it is that's coming and so forth. Interesting, I read that Jewish tradition actually suggests that those who bowed in such a way betrayed the fact that they were actually idolaters. Very interesting idea. The 300 then, to use the analogy in 1 Kings chapter 19, would be those who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Whether or not that is the actual reason, I don't know, but that is what Jewish tradition holds to as to the reason why these individuals were sent away. But regardless, God said, I want these to go home, and we're going to give these 300. A victory in these kinds of numbers would be, humanly speaking, absolutely impossible. So the people, verse 8, took victuals in their hand. In other words, they took food. And their trumpets. This is not a brass instrument with 3 valves on the top. Okay? These were ram's horns, and that's really all that it is. And he sent all the rest of Israel, every man unto his tent, and retained those 300 men. I wonder if any of them wished they had drunk the water a little bit differently. Man, I always stick my face in the water. I thought for sure this would be the one that would allow me to go home. I don't know, but he retained those 300. How did he do this? I don't know. I'm puzzled by it. You ever been singled out of a large group? Hey, I want to talk to you afterwards. I had that happen to me several times via one particular principal. It's kind of interesting. It was several times, one principal, one school year, where after the large assembly, everybody's going and out would come the principal. And he would begin to look my direction, and I would try to move to see if perhaps he was not, but his eyes consistently followed me. And as the large mass of students were going by, he would, hey, let me talk to you for just a minute. It was not a good meeting. It was not a, wow, you're really doing well. It was not the pat on the back, and nor was it, thankfully, I was old enough to not have the pat on the back side either, but it was clearly, this is not a good meeting, and it's not going to be a good meeting. I don't know if that's That's how these 300 felt or not, but the 300 were retained. And the Bible says the host of Midian was beneath him in the valley. Huge host. We know it to be over 135,000. Were there women and children there? Most likely there were. It would seem as though Israel is undetected in the woods that would be up above the valley. We find also in the preparation for the battle that there was a particular dream. We've seen the reduction of the army. Let's move on to the dream of the Midianite, verse number 9. It came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto him, Arise, get thee down into the host, for I have delivered it into thine hand. Gideon, get up and go conquer the army. They're yours for the taking. But if you fear to go down, then go with, we're going to say, Phurah, thy servant, it may be Purah, thy servant, down to the host. Gideon, get up, the battle is yours. But Gideon, if you need some additional assurance, I want you to take your servant, most likely your armor bearer, and go down to the host or to the encampment. He reminds him in verse number 9 that the battle is not one that you're going to be able to win, Gideon. Arise and get down to the host, because I have delivered them into your hand. He wasn't going in his own strength and his own confidence. God had already removed all of that. He was to go down in full faith that God would do exactly as He said He would do. But circumstances and pure human reasoning absolutely defied this move. But faith was to intervene because God had indicated He would deliver the Midianites into his hand. Do you know Gideon really only had one responsibility? Obey God's direction. But God knew that Gideon was struggling. And in His grace, He once again offered to confirm that he would be victorious. I'm amazed to ponder God's gracious and long-suffering dealings with man. The Bible teaches us in Psalm 103, verse 14, that He knoweth our frame, and He remembereth that we are but dust. In His grace, God provided one more confirmation. If you're still afraid, then I want you to take your servant and go down to the camp of the Midianites. And what I want you to do is I want you to listen to what it is that they're saying. Thou shalt hear, verse 11, what they say, and afterward shall thine hands be strengthened to go down unto the host. Then went he down with Purah his servant unto the outside of the armed men that were in the host. He went down, and this would be quite a feat in and of itself, but he went down with his servant, and they got right up to the very outskirts of the Midianite army where there were the guards who were there. The Midianites, verse 12, and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like grasshoppers for multitude. That's a bunch. Their camels were without number as the sand by the seaside for a multitude. Once again, that's a lot of camels. Okay? Their whole purpose is to come and get all of the crops from Israel. We've done this for 7 years. Let's go do it again. Hey guys, it's harvest time. Let's go have some fun with the Israelites. Oh yeah, bring your kids, bring your camels, this is going to be great. We'll pack all the grain, we'll have everything that we need. Off we'll go. And when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow. I want you to see, before I look at this dream, that it was actually quite miraculous in and of itself that God led him to one person who had a dream. We've got a group that is well over 100,000 people. He's not in the middle of the camp. He's actually at the outside of the camp, and he happens to be exactly where Gideon and his servant will be going. This is quite miraculous. And he found himself at the exact place to hear one person tell about his dream. The chances of that happening are so slim. But that was what God did for Gideon. We might read this dream as one that's rather comical. I personally do. He said, man, I had a dream last night. I dreamed, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the hosts of Midian and came unto a tent, and smote it that it fell, and overturned it that the tent lay along. I had this dream last night. Now, if I were the fellow soldier, I would struggle to not laugh at this one. But anyway, I had this terrible, maybe a nightmare. I had this dream. This cake of barley bread would be a round shape of barley bread, the cheapest bread, not made from wheat, but made from the barley grain. It came rolling down the hillside. Most likely it was some sort of a stale type of bread, because it didn't just disintegrate. But anyway, how real are our dreams? And so here comes this big piece of bread, and it goes right into a tent, overturns the tent. Wow, that's a pretty rough nightmare. I hope you were able to go back to sleep after the old loaf of bread hit you. I mean, you look at this and think, wow, I thought I had it weird, but man, I was just dreaming about bad people killing me and stuff like that. I didn't even think about the old barley loaf coming in and striking the tent. His fellow answered and said, this is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. Now, dreams in this day had interpretation. Your dreams do not. Okay, you might be able to interpret and say, I should not have eaten that late at night or something along those lines. But that's about the only revelation that your dream is really going to give. But is it not interesting that, oh man, this is nothing more than Gideon who came and killed the whole host of the Midianites. I wonder, did Gideon chuckle? He didn't loudly, that's for sure, because he would have been seen. But all of a sudden, wow. Here I am fearful of them, and the reality is they are fearful of us. They are already thinking that God is going to deliver Midian into my hands. And it was so when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof that he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord hath delivered into your hand the host of Midian. Gideon worshipped, and he returned with confidence to lead Israel into battle. I thought about this. I thought of entitling the message, One Man's Journey to Courage. Because you realize that this is the first time that Gideon has confidence that God's going to deliver him. There's been a bunch of other signs that have been there, but we don't read of Gideon ever having the confidence until after this. God graciously confirmed this time after time in multiple ways. So much so that eventually Gideon returned to the host and he said, get up. God's going to deliver him into our hands. That's a man who has grown considerably since we first found him threshing wheat in a winepress, questioning whether or not God even cared about Israel. Things drastically changed for him. We move on and we see the defeat of the Midianites. Israel was not able to do whatever they wanted to do, nor were they able to fight in whatever fashion they decided to fight. Israel had to obey very clear directions. I want you to notice verse number 16. He divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers. These would be clay jars or vessels, and lamps within the pitchers. These would be torches. And he said unto them, look on me and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be that as I do, so shall ye do. When I blow with the trumpet, I and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side of all the camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Now, were the instructions pretty clear? Very clear directions. The battle would not be won by individuals seeking to implement their own battle plan, nor would it be won by individuals who had their own ideas of how all of this should take place. The battle would instead only be won when they submitted themselves to the leader that God placed over them. Sometimes we find that God's work is greatly hindered when His people lose focus on the overall goal and become focused instead on an individual agenda. As a church, we need to be very careful that we do not go down that path. It's very damaging. What is it that we are here to do? To accomplish your goal, or are we here to accomplish God's goal? If you get wrapped up in your goal and your agenda, it may very well be that we become very sidetracked from what it is that God would have us do. It may also be that we become very divided in what it is that God would have us do. Far better it is to obey God's very clear direction. Far better it is to remain united on a very common goal. So he explains the battle plan, and now the time came for them to implement this particular plan. Now keep in mind, at this point in time, he will have divided the three different companies. I wonder what the conversation was, if any, as they would walk to their various positions. This guy's nuts. Are you going to do this? I wonder how loud he wants us to shout. Here, you blow the horn. I want to smash the pitcher. Give me the torch. How did all this work? I don't know. But what I also want you to understand is not only did they have to obey clear directions, but they also had to act in faith, obeying exactly what it was that Gideon commanded. They couldn't get to their respective positions and decide, you know what, I got a better way of doing this. Guys, let me caution you as a church, and I love you to death, we can't go down that path. Okay? We can't say, you know what? Forget this. There's a better way of doing it. I'm doing it my way. Forget that. I don't care what they say. This is what I'm doing. That kind of an attitude will absolutely destroy a ministry. We can't allow it. You can't allow it in your own home. You can't allow it within a church. It is a very damaging and very negative attitude. So nonetheless, they get there, and now, whether or not it made sense to them, that's always been one of my pet peeves. Well, I don't understand why we have to do it this way. I heard that so many times with a school. And reached the point where my line was, you don't have to understand. I don't owe you an explanation. I told you this is what I want done. Therefore, this is what's done. Well, I think you should it doesn't matter what you say. No. Okay. It doesn't matter. Well, I don't understand why do we have to smash the pitchers? Why do we have to shout the sword of the Lord and of Gideon? Why can't we just shout, here we come. You're going to die. We got you. Ha ha. Okay? None of that. There are very specific instructions, and these have to be enacted by faith. So the Bible says, verse 19, Gideon and the 100 men that were with him, the other 200 are outside in the other two companies, came unto the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch, and they had but newly set the watch. They just changed guard. It's in the middle of the night. And they blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers that were in their hands. And all of a sudden, everything that the Midianites saw was they were surrounded, and the entire area just simply lit up with a bunch of torches. Now, they had no idea there was nobody behind those torches. They just saw that they were surrounded, and there's a whole lot of torches out there. We are going to die. And the three companies did exactly what they were told to do. Blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers, held the lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal, and they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And they did this repeatedly to cause as much commotion as they possibly could. And they stood, every man in his place, round about the camp. They didn't have to go on the attack. They stood there and watched God do something absolutely amazing. And all the host ran and cried and fled, and the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow. They all began killing each other, even throughout all the hosts. And the hosts fled to Bethshittah in Zarethath, and to the border of Abel-Meholah unto Tabbath. And the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, and out of Asher, and out of all Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. After all of this, they all begin taking off, and they all begin pursuing the Midianites. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all Mount Ephraim, saying, Come down against the Midianites, and take before them the waters unto Bethbara and Jordan. Don't let them cross the Jordan. Guard the fords. There were 3 locations typically that they would cross. Guard those. Don't let them cross. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and took the waters unto Bethbara unto Jordan. And they took 2 princes of the Midianites, 2 men by the name of Oreb and Zeb. They slew Oreb upon the rock Oreb, named after he died. And Zeb they slew at the winepress of Zeb. Obviously, he was killed at a winepress. The other one's killed at the rock, and both got their names after them. And they pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. Hey, Gideon, here's the 2 princes. I'm good, okay? I don't like needles, and I don't really plan on carrying somebody's head. Okay? I'm fine. It's all right. But anyway, that's exactly what they did. God granted them the victory. I need to quickly close with 4 points to apply. Number 1, God's will is only accomplished when it is done God's way and in God's timing. If we try to do it our way, it's no longer God's will. If we try to rush, it's no longer God's will because it's our timing. God's will is only accomplished when it is done God's way and in God's timing. They didn't divide themselves over how to enact all of this. They pursued what it was that God wanted them to do. Number 2, impossible tasks become possible when we totally rely on God. God, as I mentioned, is going to put us in certain situations. We often rely too heavily on our own strength, on our own wisdom, and on our own resources. And God will put us in situations that will cause us to realize that our sufficiency is of God. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 5, Zechariah had to come to realize that God's work was not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. Paul reminds us, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. Impossible tasks become possible when we totally rely upon God. Amen. Number 3, God graciously prepares us to accomplish His will. Aren't you thankful that God is so long-suffering and gracious? It's an amazing thing to me what God puts up with me. But as I studied this, and I know this is a long point, but we have to praise Him for His gracious and long-suffering nature, and we do. But we also have to grow in our faith to the point we respond in immediate obedience. You know, I rejoice that God is a long-suffering and patient God with me. But instead of just rejoicing in that truth, I really should start making it a lot easier on God. Let's not push Him. Let's reach the point where we respond in immediate obedience, so that He doesn't have to be so long-suffering and patient. There ought to be growth in our life. We shouldn't just be content to thank Him that He's long-suffering. God, thank You for putting up with me. I'm not changing a thing, but thank You for putting up with me. That's the wrong attitude. Number 4, the odds are always in favor of the ones who obey God. Always. It may seem as though things are stacked against you, that the odds are not in your favor. But when you obey God's will, you'll discover the odds are always in your favor. The children of Israel forgot that truth and spent the next 40 years wandering in the wilderness. To them, defeat was inevitable. Romans chapter 8 and verse 31 reminds us, what shall we then say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? We listen sometimes to people telling us all the time that we can't. Let's side with God and let's accomplish His will. As a church, let's devote ourselves not to our own individual agenda. Let's devote ourselves instead to what God has for us. And let's go fulfill the ministry God has. Let's stand. We'll be dismissed in prayer.